We're going to take a look at chapter 22, and the first thing we want to see in chapter 22 is augmented and diminished intervals. So with augmented and diminished intervals, we've been talking about that a little bit throughout this class. Augmented means that you expand an interval by 1/2 step, and diminished means that you contract an interval by 1/2 step. Now, this word in particular, diminished, might mean something slightly different whether we're talking about perfect intervals or major intervals. So we'll explain that in a minute as well. But let's just take a look at a few really straightforward examples of augmented and diminished and how you would use these concepts. I'm going to start with a perfect fifth interval from A to E. Now I know that's a perfect fifth interval. I know that a few different ways because the top and the bottom accidental are the same. They're both naturals. I learned that as a little trick with fifths several chapters ago. As long as it was not the interval from B to F, then that would be true. And of course, if I forget that, I can do this with any interval. I can determine whether it is a perfect or major interval by writing the key signature of the lowest note, in this case A, and write an A major key signature, and then go from the first to the fifth and use the accidentals that are in the key signature. In this case, there are no accidentals on A or E. So again, I'm confirming that is a perfect fifth. Now, if I want to augment that fifth, go from a perfect fifth to an augmented fifth, it means that I've got to increase the distance here. I've got to expand the interval. You can always think of an interval like a floor and a ceiling. So if you raise the ceiling, it will expand. Or if you keep the ceiling the same and lower the floor, it will also expand. In other words, the distance between the ceiling and the floor. So let's try both ways. From A to E, let's go ahead and expand the ceiling. And we can do that pretty easily just by putting a sharp on that top note. So that would be an augmented fifth. Let's try it again. This time we'll use the same starting point, the A to the E, which is the perfect fifth. And we'll do it this time by lowering the floor. And you can see that to lower the floor of A, we could put A flat. And that would also be an augmented fifth because the distance from the floor to the ceiling has been expanded by a half step by lowering the floor. Okay, let's take another interval that perhaps is a little bit more thought-provoking. And we'll start with a F to a B flat. And the question is, what is that interval? Now, in most fourths, it's like fifths. So the bottom note and the same accidental goes to the bottom and the top note, then we know it's perfect. But the exception, you might recall, is from F to B. And so that will not be the case in that particular interval. You have to remember that. You might recall that this interval actually is a perfect fourth the way it is. But if you forget, you can always, for any interval, you can always put your brain in the key of the bottom note, in this case F, and write the key signature for F, which is 1 flat. And then examine the distance of a fourth from F, in this case, to B flat, because the flat is in the key signature. And because it conforms to the key signature, that's how I know that this is a perfect fourth. The reason I want to be sure of that is because if I know that's a perfect fourth, then I can deduce what an augmented fourth would be above that perfect interval. So I'm going to start with an F, and instead of writing a B flat, I'm going to expand this interval by raising the ceiling. And to raise a B flat, I turn it into a B natural. You can see that that would raise it. And I would call it an augmented fourth. Another possibility would be to start with that perfect fourth interval again. But this time, instead of raising the ceiling, I can either raise the ceiling or I can lower the floor. I'm going to lower the floor in this case. Can you see how I would have to lower that F? I'm going to turn it into an F flat. and this would also be an augmented fourth. Okay. So let's try one more interval. With these augmented varieties, I'm going to take something that's maybe a little bit more challenging. I'm going to start with this interval. A G sharp to a D sharp. So the question is, what is that interval? Now, first of all, we can't write the key signature of G sharp because we don't have a key signature for G sharp. That's one of those notes that really, you know, we have not really learned any key signature that aligns with that. There would be way too many sharps. So we have a few choices here in trying to figure out what this is. We've already memorized the fact that in most fifths, if the accidental is the same on the bottom and on the top, then it's a perfect interval. So we're going to go out on a limb here and say, well, this is probably a perfect interval, as long as it's not that B to F, where you'd have to think about it more clearly. Another thing you can always do is remove the sharps and figure out what that interval is without the sharps. And hopefully you can see from a G to a D, you might even think of the G scale. That might be helpful. That has one sharp. And then counting from the first to the fifth note, we can see that a perfect fifth would be from a G to a D with naturals. So it makes sense that from a G sharp to a D sharp would also be a perfect fifth. It's the same distance. Another way to think of this is from G to D is a perfect fifth. And if we raise both the floor and the ceiling, right? We raise both the floor and the ceiling by the same amount, the interval would stay the same. The distance between them would stay the same. So this is also a perfect fifth. Now, since we know that's a perfect fifth, let's go ahead and try to augment it. Let's augment it by raising the ceiling. You can see that creates an interesting situation, because how do you raise something that's already sharped? I hope you remember that if you double sharp it. That is how you raise something that's already been sharped. So this would be an augmented fifth. Okay. Another possibility is to start with this interval again, and let's, instead of raising the ceiling, let's go ahead and lower the floor. How do you lower a note that has a sharp on it? I hope it makes sense to you that if you take the sharp off, in this case I'm placing a natural there just to make sure that I'm taking it off, you can see that I've actually lowered the floor of this interval by lowering the sharp to a natural. So that would also be an augmented fifth.